All right, let's talk about something we've all felt. You know, that little pang when your neighbor pulls up in a brand new car and suddenly yours feels a bit dated. Or you're scrolling through a friend's vacation photos and you get that itch to just book a flight right now. Well, today we're diving deep into that feeling. We're talking about the status trap. So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll define this whole race against the Joneses. Then we'll get into the psychology of why we're just wired to compare ourselves to others. After that, we'll look at some pretty shocking data on what this does to our finances. Think about what's really driving us, and finally, ask if there's a way to actually escape this trap. Okay, let's kick things off with a feeling that's probably familiar to every single one of us, whether we like to admit it or not. And that's the drive to not just be successful, but to be a little bit more successful than the people around us. Man, the philosopher John Stuart Mill absolutely nailed it way back in the 19th century. Think about it. It's not really about having a certain amount of money in the bank. It's about our relative standing. It's like success is graded on a curve, and our peers are the ones setting it. You know, sociologists actually have a name for this whole phenomenon. Thorstein Veblen called it pecuniary emulation. I know, it's a mouthful. But it's basically the fancy academic way of saying keeping up with the Joneses. It's that deep-seated drive to signal our social standing by copying the spending habits of people we see as being a rung or two above us on the ladder. So all of this brings up a really big question. Is this whole thing just a personal flaw, a sign that we're all a bit insecure? Or is there something deeper going on, something fundamental that's hardwired into our psychology that just pushes us into this never-ending and, frankly, very expensive race? Well, it turns out that this isn't just about simple envy or wanting more stuff. The truth is, we are fundamentally wired to compare ourselves to other people. It's literally part of our psychological blueprint. And this is not a new idea by any means. Way back in 1954, a social psychologist named Leon Festinger came up with something called social comparison theory. And the core idea is pretty simple. We all have this innate drive to understand ourselves, and to do that, we use other people as our measuring stick. We look around to figure out where we stand. And we do this comparing in two main ways. First, there's what's called upward comparison. That's when we look at people who seem to have more than us. Now, sometimes that can be inspiring, right? But a lot of the time, it just makes us feel dissatisfied. Then there's downward comparison, looking at those with less. That can give our self-esteem a little boost, but it can also make us kind of lazy or complacent. And the thing is, we're doing both of these all the time, often without even realizing it. So, if we're all hardwired to compare, what happens when you throw things like income inequality and easy access to credit into the mix? Well, a really groundbreaking experiment from the World Bank decided to find out, and what they uncovered is pretty revealing. So these researchers, they set up this clever lab experiment because they wanted to find a direct causal link. They asked, does that drive to keep up actually make us behave differently with our money? Let's take a look at what they found, because it's fascinating. Okay, first finding. And get this. They discovered that when our spending is visible, when other people can see what we're buying and it can signal our status, our willingness to go into debt just skyrockets. In the group that was basically mimicking keeping up with the Joneses, borrowing more than doubled, jumping from 5% all the way up to 13% of their total funds. Just knowing that other people are watching makes us borrow more.
But here's the kicker. Who exactly is doing all of this extra borrowing? Because it wasn't spread out evenly across the board. The experiment showed that the pressure to signal status through spending hits one group way, way harder than everyone else.
And this is where it gets crazy. Look at these numbers. When their spending was made visible, the subjects in the lowest income group increased their borrowing from just 5% to a staggering 28% of their entire endowment. They went deep into debt just to keep up appearances. Meanwhile, borrowing for the middle and high-income groups barely budged. You see the trap here, right? It creates this devastating feedback loop. So inequality creates the pressure to signal your status. That pressure then encourages you to take on really costly debt, especially if you're poor. And that debt, well, it damages your finances and ends up widening the very gap that created the pressure in the first place. It is a truly vicious cycle. Wow. Okay, seeing that kind of hard data really forces you to take a step back and think. I mean, the experiment shows us what people do, but it also helps us understand why. And to really get that, we can use a pretty powerful mental model for figuring out human behavior. This quote is a great lens to look through here. The idea is, instead of just guessing why people do things, you should work backward. Look at the outcome first. So, let's ask, what was the actual result of the behavior we just saw?
Let's apply that logic. The consequence was that the poorest people in the experiment took on a completely disproportionate amount of expensive debt. So, working backward from that outcome, what can we infer about the motivation? We can infer that the motivation driving it, that deep, innate human need for status, what Veblen called pecuniary emulation, is unbelievably powerful. So, if we're all caught in this really powerful psychological and financial trap, is there a way out? It seems like the answer isn't about trying to win the race, but maybe to just stop running it altogether. Let's look at the alternative.
Now, this alternative path isn't about giving up your ambition or just throwing in the towel. It's about actively, purposefully cultivating contentment. It's the practice of being happy with your reality right now and appreciating what you already have, instead of being in that constant state of craving what you don't.
And when you do that, the benefits are just profound. I mean, escaping the status trap gives you actual peace of mind. It leads to genuine happiness. It lets you build stronger relationships that are based on who you are, not what you own. It helps you finally see the difference between your real needs and just fleeting wants, which ultimately leads to a simpler, calmer, and way less stressful life.
And that really leaves us with a final, and I think, pretty provocative thought. Our entire culture, everything we see, is built on this idea of more, better, faster. But after everything we've just seen, maybe the greatest act of rebellion and maybe the truest source of power isn't about getting ahead of the Joneses at all. Maybe it's about learning to be truly happy right where you are.